Welcome to the next video in the Maintaining a Balance series. This video we're looking at the following two dot points. Define enantiostasis as the maintenance of metabolic and physiological functions in response to variations in the environment, and discuss its importance to estuarine organisms in maintaining appropriate salt concentrations, and process and analyse information from secondary sources and use available evidence to discuss processes used by different plants for salt regulation in saline environments. So we're going to start with the define enantiostasis dot point by having a look at what enantiostasis is and discuss it in relation to estuarine organisms. So firstly, the definition of the term enantiostasis is the maintenance of normal metabolic and physiological functioning in the absence of homeostasis. So this occurs in an organism that experiences variations within their environment. So we're quite lucky. We do have some variations in terms of temperature, water availability, but these aren't that great. So enantiostasis is for those organisms where different parts of their environment fluctuate quite greatly. And one of those particular environments is called an estuary. So if you recall back to year 11, the local ecosystem topic, we went to Olympic Park and we visited the mangroves. So where the mangroves are is considered to be an estuary, and this is an environment that experiences both freshwater and saline conditions. So that's an area where a large river, which is the freshwater, meets a coastal inlet. So as we can see in this picture here, this would be our estuary here. So we've got our freshwater river and the ocean, and the water mixes in between. So this area would be experiencing quite extreme fluctuations in salt concentrations in their water. So organisms living in an estuary experience large changes in salt concentration over short periods of time due to the movements of the tides. So as the tide comes in, it brings salt water, so the salt concentration goes up. As the tide goes out, obviously takes the salt water with it, and our salt water levels decrease again. So organisms that must deal with these fluctuations are known as euryhaline. In estuaries, most organisms have a wide tolerance to changes in salinity. However, others do not, and therefore require a number of specific adaptations to overcome this. So as we can see here, we've got a number of different organisms, just examples to show you that how the external osmolarity or the external change in salt concentration relates to the internal. So here we have an organism that changes their internal salt levels in relationship to the external. And here we have an organism that keeps it fairly constant. So this organism here can deal with massive fluctuations in salt level changes, whereas number 4 can only deal with small ones. So the X's show the levels that would cause the organisms to die. So we'll be looking at the difference between these organisms here and these organisms here and what they're referred to. So simple strategies that organisms can use in order to deal with this is moving away from the mouth of the estuary. So they'll move further inland when the salt comes in or the tide comes in order to get away from the higher salt concentration. Another way is closing the shells. So obviously mollusks are able to close their shell to stop the salt water from coming in, and burrowing deep into the mud or sand, which we saw was an adaptation of the crabs in the mangrove environment that we visited. Mud-dwelling organisms often avoid desiccation or drying out by burrowing and staying on the moist mud. An issue related to this, however, is obviously if you burrow, there's a lack of oxygen, and also the mud and things has a presence of toxic chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide, and these can be harmful to the organism. Organisms must have mechanisms or adaptations for osmoregulation, excretion of unwanted chemicals, and also have blood that has a higher affinity to carry the oxygen. So if they don't have these things, then obviously they won't be able to survive the changes in their environment. So one strategy that organisms who have a narrow salinity tolerance employ is that they are able to have the body's osmotic pressure vary with the environment. So organisms that do this and therefore do not maintain homeostasis are known as osmoconformers. So as the level of salt increases, the salt concentration inside their cells also increases. So they're conforming to their environment. So most marine invertebrates are osmoconformers, so simple organisms are able to change their salt level, excuse me, as it doesn't really impact on a lot of the other body systems. In contrast, marine mammals and most fish are what we call osmoregulators. So they maintain homeostasis. They keep their salt concentration and water concentration inside the cells at a steady state, regardless of what the environment is. The biggest issue here is as the salt concentration inside an osmoconformer changes, it can have an impact on various bodily functions, for example, the activity of enzymes. So to be able to function normally, they need to be able to change other bodily functions in order to be able to deal with this. So these types of organisms can change the pH of their body fluids, which helps to increase the efficiency of the same enzyme. So this graph here is just similar to the one that we saw before, but now it explains what each of the different lines represent. So our osmoregulators keep a fairly stable internal osmotic pressure as the osmotic pressure of the environment changes, where our osmoconformers, the internal osmotic pressure is pretty much in perfect relationship with the external. So as the external osmotic pressure increases, the internal osmotic pressure increases as well. And this just shows us some examples. So our freshwater eel and salmon, as well as a crab, are fairly osmoregulated, so they keep their internal salt concentrations fairly stable, whereas our polychaete worm, which is an invertebrate, changes its salinity with the water salinity. So for the second part of this video, we need to process and analyse information from secondary sources and use evidence to discuss processes used by different plants for salt regulation in saline environments. So we're specifically looking at plants. So for this secondary source investigation, a bit of background information that we need to know. So plants that can survive in saline or salty environments are known as halophytes. Halophytes are able to tolerate high levels of salt in their tissues, as well as regulate and control this level. So mangroves are a group of trees, shrubs, and herbs that live in intertidal zones, as we said, so in our estuaries, and they have a number of adaptations that allow them to cope with the salty environment that they live in. So here we see a cross-section or a transect of an intertidal zone, where we have our low tide, which is where the plants are during most of the time, and then our mean high tide. So when the water comes in from the oceans, all of these plants here are inundated with salt water, and then as the tide goes out, there is minimal water available for these plants here. So the different plants that live here, we've got a number of different mangrove species who are able to deal with these changes in concentration in different ways. So some adaptations of mangroves. The first one is salt exclusion. So as we can see here, the membrane in the root of the mangroves can stop the salt from entering their tissues. So the roots are able to prevent about 95% of the salt in the soil from entering, and that salt then crystallizes on the soil, and it almost looks a bit like snow in this picture here, but that's salt crystals that have dried. So coastal mangroves are able to prevent 98% of the salt entering, simply because they've adapted to dealing with much greater salt levels. Salt storage and removal. So salt levels in the xylem can be kept low by the salt remaining in the roots or by entering older parts of the plant, like this leaf here in comparison to the others. So these older leaves will accumulate the salt, and then once it's got to a certain level, they will drop off the leaf. So when the leaf drops off from the plant, it takes the salt with it. The next one is salt excretion. So the leaves of halophytes actively secrete salt from glands on the leaf surface. So it's usually on the underside of the leaf. And then this salt crystallizes and is removed by wind or rain. So when the wind comes along, it blows the crystals off, or the water comes down, the salt crystals dissolve and they get washed away. So you'll recall seeing those when we went on the excursion. So the last adaptation we have is osmotic adjustment. So higher concentration of dissolved substances in the cells than the salt-sensitive plants. So this helps to increase the amount of water inside the cell to maintain turgor. So as we can see here, this plant is being able to increase the amount of water that's inside the cell, which helps to keep the cells nice and turgid and provide the plant with support. However, this one here, lots of solutes and things have left, so the water has left the cell and has resulted in a water deficit or the plant beginning to die. And that's all for this video, so thank you.